Behind the golden gates of Aldermore Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern scandal, a family that has ruled for generations faces its darkest hour. When love, duty, and blood collide, even crowns can shatter. What happens when those sworn to protect the monarchy become its greatest threat? The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Aldermore Palace as King Edmund sat alone in his private study, staring at the damning photographs scattered across his mahogany desk. Each image told a story he wished were fiction: his beloved wife, Queen Isabel, in intimate conversation with a man who was not him. The timestamp on the photos showed they were taken just 3 days ago, during what she had told him was a charity meeting. Edmund's weathered hands trembled as he picked up the first photograph. 28 years of marriage, and it had come to this. The man in the images was Victor Ashworth, Isabel's childhood friend who had recently returned to court as her personal advisor. Edmund had welcomed him warmly, never suspecting that behind his warm smile lay a betrayal that would shake the very foundations of the House of Aldermore. The heavy oak door creaked open, and his eldest son, Prince Alexander, stepped inside without knocking, a privilege only family members dared to take. At 35, Alexander bore the weight of his future crown with the same seriousness that had defined the Aldermore line for 3 centuries. His usually composed expression cracked when he saw the photographs. "Father, what are these?" Alexander asked, though the answer was written clearly across his face as realization dawned. "Your mother," Edmund said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Victor Ashworth." Alexander moved closer, his polished boots silent on the Persian carpet. The crown prince had inherited his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's diplomatic grace, but now those eyes blazed with an emotion Edmund rarely saw in his composed air: fury. "How long have you known?" Alexander demanded, sinking into the leather chair across from his father's desk. "The photographs arrived this morning. Anonymous envelope, no return address." Edmund's voice carried the weight of a man watching his world crumble. But, looking back now, there were signs. Late meetings, whispered phone calls, the way she looked at him during state functions. The study fell silent except for the rain's relentless rhythm against the windows. This room had witnessed the planning of wars, the negotiation of treaties, and the celebration of royal births. Now it bore witness to the potential destruction of the monarchy itself. Alexander leaned forward, studying the images with the analytical mind that had made him an effective crown prince. "These could be doctored, father. In this digital age, anyone with the right software could look at her face, Alexander." Edmund's interruption was sharp, cutting through his son's desperate hope. "Look at the way she touches his arm, the way she leans into him. I've been married to your mother for nearly 3 decades. I know her expressions better than I know my own." Prince Alexander had always been the dutiful son, the one who followed protocol and honored tradition above all else. But, as he stared at the evidence of his mother's betrayal, something fundamental shifted in his worldview. The woman who had taught him about honor and duty had abandoned both. "What are you going to do?" Alexander asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. King Edmund rose from his chair and walked to the window, watching the rain create rivers down the ancient glass. Beyond the palace grounds, the capital city of Valerian continued its daily rhythm, unaware that their royal family was fracturing behind closed doors. "I don't know," Edmund admitted, a confession that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Kings were supposed to have answers, solutions, decisive action plans. But this wasn't a matter of state that could be resolved with legislation or diplomacy. "You have to confront her," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength. "Mother needs to explain herself." "And then, what?" Edmund turned back to face his son. "If these photos become public, the scandal could destroy everything our family has built. The opposition parties are already questioning the monarchy's relevance. This would give them the ammunition they need to call for abolition." Alexander stood and began pacing, a habit he'd inherited from his father during moments of intense stress. "We could contain it. Pay off whoever took these photos, ensure their silence. And live with the knowledge that our marriage is a lie?" Edmund's laugh was bitter. "That every public appearance, every state dinner, every moment of what appears to be marital happiness is nothing more than theater?" The crown prince stopped pacing and looked directly at his father. In that moment, he saw not the powerful monarch who had ruled for 20 years, but a broken man whose private pain was about to become very public. "There's something else," Edmund said, his voice dropping even lower. "Victor Ashworth isn't just your mother's advisor. His sister, Margaret, is dating your brother Charles. If this scandal breaks, it won't just destroy your mother and me, it could tear our entire family apart." Alexander felt his stomach drop. Prince Charles, his younger brother by 3 years, had been seeing Margaret Ashworth for nearly 6 months. Charles was already the more rebellious of the two princes, and his relationship with Margaret had been a source of minor controversy due to her commoner status. If Margaret's brother was revealed as the Queen's lover, the scandal would engulf them all. "Does Charles know?" Alexander asked. "I haven't told him yet. I wanted to speak with you first." Edmund returned to his desk, gathering the photographs into a neat pile. "You're the heir, Alexander. Someday, you'll be king, and you'll face impossible choices. This is your first lesson in how personal pain and royal duty can become impossible to reconcile." The weight of that responsibility settled on Alexander's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had been trained since childhood to put the crown before everything else, but how could he choose between protecting the monarchy and supporting his heartbroken father? "We need more information," Alexander said finally. "Before we make any decisions, we need to know the full scope of what we're dealing with. How long has this been going on? How serious is their relationship? Who else might know about it?" Edmund nodded, grateful for his son's practical approach even in the midst of emotional turmoil. "I've already contacted Director Harrison from Palace Security. He's conducting a discreet investigation." "And, Mother? When will you confront her?" "Tonight. After the state reception for the Meridian ambassador. We can't afford to disrupt official duties, even now." Alexander understood the bitter irony. Even as their personal world collapsed, the royal machine continued its relentless forward motion. There would be handshakes and formal dinners, speeches and photo opportunities, all while the family's foundation crumbled beneath their feet. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock interrupted the heavy silence. Princess Victoria, Alexander's younger sister, peered around the door with her characteristic bright smile. "Father, Mother sent me to remind you about the reception tonight." The ambassador's party has already arrived, and Victoria stopped mid-sentence as she noticed the tension in the room. At 28, she possessed an intuitive understanding of family dynamics that made her an invaluable mediator during royal disputes. "What's wrong?" she asked, closing the door behind her and moving toward the desk. Edmund and Alexander exchanged glances. Victoria would need to know eventually, the scandal would affect her as well, but neither man relished the thought of shattering her faith in their mother. "Sit down, Victoria," Edmund said gently. As Princess Victoria settled into the chair beside her brother, Edmund realized that this moment marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The photographs on his desk weren't just evidence of adultery, they were the first dominoes in what could become the complete destruction of the House of Aldermore. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and, somewhere in the palace, Queen Isabel prepared for another evening of royal duties, unaware that her secret had been discovered and that her family's world was about to change forever. The crown had survived civil wars, foreign invasions, and political upheavals spanning centuries. But, as King Edmund looked at his children's faces, Alexander's determined anger and Victoria's growing concern, he wondered if it could survive the more intimate destruction that came from within. The state reception would begin in 2 hours. The show, as they say, must go on. But, after tonight, nothing would ever be the same for the royal family of Aldermore. The grand ballroom of Aldermore Palace gleamed under 1,000 crystal chandeliers as the Meridian diplomatic delegation mingled with carefully selected members of the nobility and government. Queen Isabel moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her emerald silk gown catching the light as she engaged in diplomatic small talk with the ambassador's wife. To the casual observer, she appeared the perfect royal hostess, poised, elegant, and completely in control. King Edmund watched her from across the room, maintaining his own conversations while keeping one eye on his wife's every movement. The photographs from his study seemed to burn in his jacket pocket, a constant reminder of the confrontation that awaited them once the evening's duties were complete. Every smile she offered, every graceful gesture, now seemed tainted by deception. Prince Alexander stood near the orchestra, nodding politely as the Meridian Trade Minister explained their new export policies. His training in diplomatic protocol served him well, allowing him to maintain appropriate responses while his mind wrestled with the family crisis unfolding beneath the surface of royal propriety. Across the room, he caught sight of Victor Ashworth engaging Queen Isabel in what appeared to be official conversation, but Alexander now noticed details he had missed before: the way Victor's hand lingered on the Queen's arm, the intimate angle of their bodies as they spoke. Princess Victoria, resplendent in midnight blue, charmed a group of young diplomats with stories of her recent humanitarian work in Eastern Europe. Her laughter rang genuine and clear, a stark contrast to the forced smiles her father and brother maintained. She remained unaware of the storm clouds gathering around their family, and both Edmund and Alexander found themselves wanting to preserve her innocence for as long as possible. The one notable absence was Prince Charles, who had begged off the evening's events claiming illness. In reality, he was spending the evening with Margaret Ashworth at her London apartment, blissfully unaware that her brother's actions were about to destroy both their relationship and his family's stability. As the evening progressed, Director Harrison, head of palace security, appeared at King Edmund's side during a brief lull in conversation. Harrison was a compact man in his 50s whose unremarkable appearance made him perfect for his job. He could blend into any crowd while observing everything. "Your Majesty," Harrison said quietly, "might I request a private word?" Edmund excused himself from the group of ministers he'd been entertaining and followed Harrison to a quiet alcove near the grand staircase. The security director's expression was grave. "I've completed the preliminary investigation you requested," Harrison said, keeping his voice low despite the music and conversation that provided natural cover. "The situation is more serious than the photographs suggest." Edmund's heart sank. He had harbored a desperate hope that the images might represent an isolated incident, a momentary lapse in judgment that could be contained and forgiven. Harrison's tone suggested otherwise. "Tell me everything," Edmund said. "The relationship between Her Majesty and Mr. Ashworth began approximately 4 months ago, shortly after his appointment as personal advisor. Initial contact was professional, but surveillance footage from various palace areas shows the relationship became personal rather quickly." Edmund closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the timeline. 4 months of deception, 4 months of looking him in the eye and lying about late meetings and evening appointments. "How many others know?" he asked. "That's the concerning part, Your Majesty. At least 3 palace staff members have noticed irregular patterns: late-night meetings in the Queen's private study, unexplained changes in her schedule, the purchase of personal gifts that weren't accounted for in official records. While none of them understand the full picture, there's enough unusual activity that rumors have begun circulating among the staff." The implications hit Edmund like a physical blow. Palace staff gossip had a way of reaching the press with startling efficiency. If rumors were already circulating, it was only a matter of time before a reporter began asking uncomfortable questions. "There's more," Harrison continued. "Mr. Ashworth has been meeting regularly with Oliver Blackwood from the Daily Herald. We initially assumed these were social meetings, they knew each other at university, but the timing suggests otherwise." Edmund's blood ran cold. Oliver Blackwood was the Herald's chief royal correspondent, known for his relentless pursuit of palace scandals and his willingness to publish stories that other papers wouldn't touch. If Victor Ashworth was sharing details about his relationship with the Queen, the story could break at any moment. "Do we know what they've discussed?" Edmund asked. "Not specifically, but Blackwood has been asking unusual questions about the Queen's schedule and her relationship with her advisors. He's also been digging into Mr. Ashworth's background and financial records." Edmund felt the weight of the crown more heavily than he had in years. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore, it was a potential constitutional crisis. The opposition parties had been gaining ground in recent polls, and a royal scandal of this magnitude could provide them with the justification they needed to call for the abolition of the monarchy altogether. "What are my options?" Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Very limited, I'm afraid. We could attempt to contain the story through traditional channels, legal injunctions, appeals to editorial discretion, but, given the Herald's track record, I doubt they would cooperate." We could also consider more direct action regarding Mr. Ashworth's position at court. You mean dismiss him? Remove him from his advisory role, yes. However, that action itself might raise questions and, potentially accelerate whatever timeline Mr. Blackwood is working under. Edmund stared across the ballroom at his wife, who was now speaking with the Meridian ambassador while Victor Ashworth stood attentively nearby. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were discussing diplomatic relations and international cooperation while their own relationship was built on lies and betrayal. How much time do we have? Edmund asked. Unknown. Could be days, could be weeks. But, Your Majesty, you should prepare for the possibility that this story could break at any moment. When it does, you'll need to be ready with a response strategy. Before Edmund could reply, Princess Victoria appeared at his side, her face showing the first signs of concern he'd seen all evening. Father, is everything all right? She asked, glancing between her father and Director Harrison. You've been gone from the reception for quite a while, and Mother was asking about you. Edmund forced a smile, drawing on decades of experience in maintaining royal composure under pressure. Just discussing security arrangements for next week's state visit. Nothing to worry about, my dear. Victoria didn't look entirely convinced, but she accepted the explanation with a nod. The ambassador was hoping to speak with you about the trade agreements before the evening ends. Of course. Harrison, we'll continue this conversation tomorrow morning. As they returned to the reception, Edmund's mind raced through the impossible choices ahead of him. He could confront Isabel tonight and demand the truth, but, without a clear strategy for managing the aftermath, he risked making the situation worse. He could wait and hope that Victor Ashworth's meetings with Oliver Blackwood were innocent, but every day of delay increased the risk of public exposure. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of diplomatic niceties and forced conversations. Edmund played his role perfectly, the gracious king, devoted husband, and proud father. But, inside, he felt like an actor performing in a play where he didn't know the ending. As the last guests departed and the palace staff began the process of returning the ballroom to its normal state, the royal family gathered in the blue drawing room for their traditional post-event debriefing. Queen Isabel kicked off her heels and settled into her favorite armchair with visible relief. I think that went quite well, she said, addressing the room while directing her words primarily toward Edmund. The ambassador seemed genuinely pleased with the cultural exchange proposals. Prince Alexander nodded absently, but Victoria noticed his distraction immediately. Alex, you've been quiet all evening. Are you feeling well? Just tired, Alexander replied, though his eyes met his father's across the room. Queen Isabel looked more closely at her husband and eldest son, her diplomatic instincts finally picking up on the tension that had been present all evening. Actually, now that Victoria mentions it, you both seem rather subdued. Did something happen during the Harrison meeting? The moment hung heavy in the air. Edmund realized that this might be his opportunity to begin the conversation that would determine their family's future. But, looking at Victoria's innocent concern and Isabel's unsuspecting question, he found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he needed to say. We should discuss it privately, Edmund said finally, his voice carefully neutral. After Victoria retires. Princess Victoria caught the subtle dismissal and rose gracefully. Well, if you're planning one of your boring political discussions, I'll gladly escape to my books. She kissed both parents goodnight and squeezed Alexander's shoulder affectionately before departing. Once they were alone, the atmosphere in the blue drawing room shifted dramatically. Queen Isabel seemed to sense the change immediately, her posture becoming more alert and defensive. What's going on? She asked, looking between her husband and son. Edmund reached into his jacket and withdrew the envelope containing the photographs. With hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor, he placed them on the coffee table between them. Queen Isabel's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and, finally, resignation. She didn't need to look at the images to know what they contained. Her reaction told Edmund everything he needed to know about their authenticity. How long have you known? She asked quietly. Since this morning, Edmund replied. But, apparently, everyone else has known longer than I have. The confrontation that would determine the fate of the House of Aldermore had finally begun. The silence that followed Edmund's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Queen Isabel sat frozen in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The photographs lay scattered on the coffee table between them like accusations that could no longer be ignored. Isabel, Edmund said, his voice carrying 20 years of royal authority and 28 years of marital disappointment. I need you to tell me everything. Prince Alexander remained standing near the fireplace, feeling like an intruder in his parents' private catastrophe yet unable to leave. As the heir to the throne, he understood that this conversation would affect not just his family's personal relationships, but the very future of the monarchy itself. Queen Isabel finally looked up, and, for the first time in months, Edmund saw his wife without her carefully constructed royal mask. The woman before him looked older, more fragile, and utterly defeated. It wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. When Victor returned to court, I thought we could simply be friends. We had so much history together, shared memories from before all of this. She gestured vaguely around the opulent room, encompassing not just their surroundings but their entire royal existence. Before all of what? Alexander asked, speaking for the first time since they'd gathered. His voice carried a hardness that surprised even him. Isabel looked at her eldest son, seeing the judgment in his eyes and the disappointment that mirrored his father's expression. Before I became a symbol instead of a person. Before every conversation was calculated, every gesture scrutinized, every emotion measured for its impact on public opinion. Edmund leaned forward in his chair. That's not an excuse, Isabel. We all live with those constraints. We all made sacrifices when we accepted our roles. Did we? Isabel's voice gained strength, and Edmund caught a glimpse of the passionate woman he had fallen in love with 3 decades ago. You were born to this life, Edmund. You never had a choice. But I did, and I chose to give up everything I was to become what you needed me to be. The perfect queen, the devoted wife, the model mother. And you've been those things, Edmund said, confusion mixing with his anger. You've been exceptional in every role. Have I? Isabel stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where autumn had stripped the trees bare. When was the last time we had a real conversation, Edmund? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, what I thought about something that didn't relate to state functions or royal duties? Alexander felt increasingly uncomfortable as his parents' marriage was dissected before his eyes, but he understood that he couldn't leave. As crown prince, he needed to understand the full scope of the crisis they were facing. That's how royal marriages work, Edmund said, his voice defensive. We have responsibilities that come before personal desires. And that's exactly what Victor offered me. Isabel turned back to face them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He saw me as Isabel, not as Her Majesty Queen Isabel. When I spoke with him, I didn't have to calculate the political implications of every word. So you decided to have an affair, Alexander said bluntly, his patience exhausted by what he saw as self-serving justifications. Isabel flinched as if she'd been slapped. It wasn't that simple, Alexander. It started as friendship, as someone to talk to who remembered who I used to be before I became a public figure. When did it become more? Edmund asked, his voice deadly quiet. The Queen returned to her chair, seeming to age years in the space of moments. 6 weeks ago. After the state dinner for the Nordic delegation. I was exhausted, and Victor offered to help me review my schedule for the following week. We were alone in my private study, and he... I don't need the details, Edmund interrupted harshly. But, you do, Isabel said with sudden firmness. If we're going to address this honestly, you need to understand what happened and why. Edmund stared at his wife, seeing a stranger wearing Isabel's face. The woman he thought he knew would never have risked everything they had built together for an affair with a childhood friend. He kissed me, Isabel continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. And, for the first time in years, I felt like a woman instead of a crown. For just a moment, I remembered what it felt like to be desired for myself rather than for what I represented. Alexander closed his eyes, wishing he could unhear his mother's confession. This was far beyond anything his royal training had prepared him to handle. "What about your marriage vows?" Edmund asked. "What about our family? What about them?" Isabel's response shocked both men with its directness. "Our marriage stopped being about love years ago, Edmund. We're partners in a very successful business arrangement. We attend functions together, we present a united front for public appearances, and we maintain separate bedrooms because we're both too tired from our royal duties to maintain any real intimacy." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Edmund wanted to deny it, but the truth was that he couldn't remember the last time he and Isabel had shared anything beyond polite conversation about their schedules and obligations. "That doesn't justify betrayal," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If you were unhappy, you should have discussed it with father. You could have sought counseling, taken time away from public duties, anything except this." "Should I have?" Isabel looked at her son with sad recognition. "Alexander, you're already becoming just like your father. Everything in your world is measured by duty and protocol. When was the last time you did something purely for joy? When was the last time any of us did?" Before Alexander could respond, the door to the blue drawing room burst open, and Prince Charles strode in with the casual confidence that had always characterized his approach to royal protocol. His dark hair was disheveled, and his formal evening wear had been replaced by jeans and a sweater that suggested he had indeed spent the evening in more casual company. "Sorry I'm late," Charles said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Margaret and I lost track of time, and I thought you might still be discussing the reception." He stopped abruptly as he noticed his family's expressions and the photographs scattered on the coffee table. "What's going on?" Charles asked, his casual demeanor evaporating as he registered the gravity of the scene before him. Edmund looked at his younger son and felt his heart break a little more. Charles had always been the more carefree of his children, the one who struggled most with royal constraints but maintained an infectious optimism about life. In moments, that optimism would be shattered. "Charles," Edmund said gently, "you need to sit down." Prince Charles looked around the room again, noting his mother's tear-stained face, his father's grim expression, and Alexander's rigid posture. Without a word, he moved to the sofa and sat down heavily. "It's about Margaret's brother, isn't it?" Charles said quietly, and Edmund realized that his younger son was more perceptive than any of them had given him credit for. "You knew?" Alexander asked. "I suspected something," Charles admitted. Margaret mentioned that Victor had been spending a lot of time at the palace, more than his advisory duties required. And, lately, she's been asking strange questions about royal protocols regarding scandals and public relations disasters. Queen Isabel made a small sound of distress. "Margaret knows?" "Not everything," Charles said, looking directly at his mother for the first time. "But she's not stupid. She's noticed that her brother has been happier lately, and, when she pressed him about it, he admitted he had feelings for someone at court but couldn't discuss the details." Edmund felt the situation spiraling further out of control. If Margaret Ashworth suspected something, how long before she confided in friends or family? How long before the speculation became public knowledge? "There's something else," Charles continued, his voice becoming more serious. "Margaret received a phone call yesterday from a journalist asking questions about Victor's work at the palace and his relationship with royal family members. She didn't give him any information, but she was shaken by it." "Oliver Blackwood from the Herald," Alexander said grimly. Charles nodded. "She didn't mention the name, but the description fits. The journalist seemed to know more than he should have about Victor's schedule and his access to palace areas." Edmund stood and began pacing, a habit he'd developed during particularly difficult cabinet meetings. The situation was deteriorating faster than he had imagined possible. Within days, possibly hours, the story would break, and the House of Aldermore would face its greatest crisis in generations. "We need a strategy," Edmund said, his mind shifting into the problem-solving mode that had served him well during 20 years of kingship. "If this story is going to become public, we need to control how it unfolds." "What are our options?" Alexander asked, grateful to focus on practical solutions rather than emotional recriminations. We could get ahead of the story, Charles suggested. Issue a statement acknowledging that Mother and Victor Ashworth had developed feelings for each other but that the relationship is ending and no impropriety occurred. That's essentially admitting to an emotional affair, Alexander pointed out. It might minimize the scandal, but it would still damage the monarchy's reputation. What's the alternative? Charles asked. Wait for the Herald to publish whatever version of the story they've constructed? Let them control the narrative? Edmund stopped pacing and looked at his wife, who had remained silent during their strategic discussion. Isabel, what do you want to do? Queen Isabel looked up at her husband with an expression of profound sadness. I want to tell the truth. Which truth? Edmund asked. All of it. Isabel's voice was steady now, as if she had finally found solid ground beneath her feet. I want to tell the public that I made a mistake, that I allowed personal feelings to compromise my judgment, and that I take full responsibility for my actions. That would destroy everything, Alexander protested. The monarchy can't survive that kind of admission. Maybe it's time, Isabel said quietly. Maybe the monarchy needs to acknowledge that we're human beings capable of making human mistakes, rather than pretending to be perfect symbols. Edmund stared at his wife, recognizing something he hadn't seen in her for years: complete honesty. It was both refreshing and terrifying. If you do that, Edmund said slowly, there's no going back. The opposition parties will use your confession to argue that the royal family has become a liability. They'll push for abolition. Then, we'll deal with that when it happens, Isabel replied. But I won't spend the rest of my life living a lie. The room fell silent as each family member contemplated the magnitude of the decision before them. Outside, the palace clock tower chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another that would change their lives forever. The early morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the palace's crisis management room as the royal family gathered for what would become known among palace staff as Black Thursday. Director Harrison had arrived before dawn with a team of communications specialists, legal advisors, and security personnel. The long mahogany table was covered with newspapers, tablets displaying online news feeds, and thick folders containing strategy documents that had been prepared for various scandal scenarios throughout the years. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, looking older than his 58 years. He had managed only 2 hours of sleep, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and contemplating the impossible choices ahead. Queen Isabel sat to his left, her usual morning elegance replaced by the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who had faced the complete destruction of their carefully constructed life. Prince Alexander entered the room carrying his tablet and a stack of international newspapers. His systematic approach to crisis management had kicked into overdrive, and he had spent the pre-dawn hours analyzing similar royal scandals from other monarchies to understand potential outcomes and survival strategies. The story breaks in 4 hours, Alexander announced without preamble as he took his seat. Oliver Blackwood just published a preview on the Herald's website, promising explosive revelations about the royal marriage in this morning's print edition. Princess Victoria, who had been summoned early and briefed on the family crisis, sat beside her brother with the stunned expression of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered overnight. She had always been the family's optimist, the one who believed in fairy tale endings and the inherent goodness of those she loved. Learning of her mother's affair had challenged everything she thought she knew about her family. Prince Charles was the last to arrive, having spent the night at Margaret Ashworth's apartment in a futile attempt to convince her to leave London before the scandal broke. Margaret had refused, insisting that running away would only make everything worse and that she needed to stand by her brother during the crisis ahead. "Where do we stand with damage control?" Edmund asked, his voice carrying the authority of a king but the weariness of a man facing personal destruction. Sarah Matthews, the palace's director of communications, opened her tablet and began reading from her notes. Sarah had managed royal public relations for 15 years, successfully navigating everything from minor protocol breaches to major political controversies, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this level of personal scandal. "The good news is that we still have some control over the narrative," Sarah began. Blackwood's preview is heavy on innuendo but light on specific details. He has the photographs, but he's clearly fishing for more information before publishing the full story.
What kind of information? Victoria asked, speaking for the first time since entering the room.
Details about the physical nature of the relationship, evidence of how long it's been ongoing, and, most importantly, any indication that state secrets or royal duties were compromised, Sarah replied. Right now, he has proof of intimate conversations and, potentially inappropriate closeness, but nothing that definitively proves a sexual relationship.
Queen Isabel shifted uncomfortably in her chair. So he's hoping someone will provide those details? Exactly. Which gives us options. Sarah pulled up a presentation on the wall-mounted screen.
Option 1, we get ahead of the story with a carefully crafted statement acknowledging an inappropriate friendship that crossed professional boundaries but denying any physical affair. That's lying, Isabel said firmly.
It's strategic truth-telling, Sarah corrected. We acknowledge wrongdoing while minimizing the damage.
The public might accept that the Queen had feelings for someone but didn't act on them in a way that violated her marriage vows. Edmund looked at his wife, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw that had always appeared when she was asked to compromise her principles.
What's option 2? Full disclosure, Alexander answered before Sarah could respond.
Mother tells the complete truth, accepts full responsibility, and we deal with the consequences. The consequences could include the end of the monarchy, Sarah warned. The opposition parties have been looking for an excuse to call for abolition.
A confession of adultery by the Queen would give them exactly what they need. Director Harrison leaned forward, consulting his own notes. There's also the security aspect to consider. Victor Ashworth has had access to classified information through his advisory role.
If the affair becomes public knowledge, we'll need to conduct a full review of every document he's seen and every meeting he's attended.
Do we suspect he's shared state secrets?
Charles asked.
No evidence of that so far, Harrison replied. But the opposition will certainly raise the possibility.
They'll argue that personal involvement with a royal family member could have compromised his professional judgment.
Edmund rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the crown more heavily than ever before. Every option seemed to lead to destruction, either personal or institutional. What about Victor himself? Victoria asked. What is he planning to do? Harrison consulted another folder.
He's retained legal counsel and is refusing all media contact. His lawyer reached out this morning requesting a meeting to discuss mutual interests in containing the situation.
He wants to negotiate, Alexander said grimly.
Probably looking for financial compensation in exchange for his silence.
We don't negotiate with blackmailers, Edmund said firmly. That sets a precedent we can't afford.
But we could meet with him, Isabel said quietly. I could speak with him, explain what this is doing to our family, ask him to consider the greater good.
Absolutely not, Charles said immediately. Any contact between you two right now would be seen as evidence of ongoing inappropriate relationship. The room fell silent as each person contemplated the impossible situation they faced.
Outside the palace walls, the nation was beginning its daily routine, unaware that their royal family was fracturing behind closed doors. Sarah Matthews cleared her throat.
There is one more option we haven't discussed. What's that? Edmund asked. Abdication.
The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner.
Princess Victoria gasped audibly, while Prince Charles went pale.
Alexander's expression remained stoic, but his hands clenched involuntarily. If your majesty were to abdicate, Sarah continued carefully, it would allow Prince Alexander to ascend to the throne with a clean slate. The scandal would be seen as belonging to the previous reign, not the current one.
That's not a solution, Alexander said immediately. That's surrender. Sometimes strategic retreat is the wisest course, Sarah replied.
The institution of the monarchy is more important than any individual monarch. Edmund looked around the table at his family, seeing the fear and uncertainty in their faces. Alexander was right. Abdication felt like surrender, like allowing personal failure to destroy centuries of tradition. But it might also be the only way to preserve the crown for future generations.
How much time do we have to decide? Edmund asked.
The Herald goes to print in 3 hours, Sarah replied.
Whatever we decide, we need to implement it before the story breaks.
Before anyone could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door.
Director Harrison's assistant entered with obvious urgency.
Sir, Victor Ashworth is here.
He's requesting an immediate meeting with their majesties.
The room erupted in hushed conversation as everyone began speaking at once. Edmund raised his hand for silence, his mind racing through the implications of Victor's unexpected arrival.
He's here now? Edmund asked.
Yes, Your Majesty. He arrived 15 minutes ago with his legal counsel, insisting that he has information that could change how this situation unfolds. Edmund looked at Isabel, seeing hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the photographs had been discovered.
What kind of information? He wouldn't provide details, sir.
He simply stated that there are aspects of the situation that the family needs to understand before making any public statements.
Alexander stood abruptly. This could be a trap. He might be recording this conversation for the Herald.
Or he might genuinely want to minimize the damage, Victoria said, her natural optimism reasserting itself.
Edmund considered the options rapidly.
Meeting with Victor Ashworth carried enormous risks, but refusing to hear what he had to say could be equally dangerous. If Victor had information that could change the public's perception of the scandal, they needed to know what it was.
Bring him in, Edmund decided.
But, I want Harrison's people monitoring everything. As the assistant left to retrieve Victor Ashworth, the royal family prepared for what might be their most crucial conversation in decades. The future of the House of Aldermore hung in the balance, and, in minutes, they would face the man whose actions had brought them to this precipice. Queen Isabel straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of royal composure that had been cultivated over nearly 3 decades. Whatever Victor had to say, she would face it with the dignity befitting her position, even if that position was about to be destroyed. The door opened, and Victor Ashworth entered the crisis management room, followed closely by a man in an expensive suit who was obviously his legal counsel. Victor looked haggard, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. As he stepped into the room where the royal family sat in judgment, the final act of the drama that had begun with stolen photographs and secret meetings was about to unfold. Your Majesties, Victor said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I need to tell you something that will change everything you think you know about this situation. Victor Ashworth stood at the foot of the conference table, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the assembled royal family. His legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, remained by the door with a briefcase clutched protectively against her chest. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for Victor to deliver whatever revelation had brought him to the palace at this critical moment. King Edmund studied the man who had destroyed his marriage, noting the deep circles under Victor's eyes and the way his usually perfect posture had collapsed under the weight of what appeared to be crushing guilt. Queen Isabel couldn't bring herself to look directly at him, her gaze fixed instead on her folded hands. Before you say anything, Patricia Wells interjected, stepping forward, I need to establish that this conversation is protected by attorney-client privilege and that any statements made here cannot be used against my client in future legal proceedings.
This isn't a courtroom, Prince Alexander said coldly. And, we're not here to prosecute anyone.
Nevertheless, Wells continued, Mr. Ashworth is taking considerable personal risk by coming forward with this information. He needs assurance that his cooperation will be acknowledged should this matter proceed to formal legal review. Edmund raised his hand to stop the legal posturing. Mr. Ashworth, you requested this meeting. What do you have to tell us? Victor took a deep breath and looked directly at Queen Isabel for the first time since entering the room. The affair you're all preparing to manage never happened. The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the antique clock seemed to echo like gunshots. Princess Victoria was the first to break the stunned quiet.
What do you mean it never happened? She asked.
Victor's attorney opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. My client has been working undercover for the past 6 months as part of a security investigation into potential threats against the royal family. Director Harrison shot to his feet.
That's impossible. I would know about any undercover operation involving palace personnel. Not necessarily, Wells replied calmly.
This investigation was initiated at the highest levels of government intelligence, specifically to address concerns about potential infiltration of palace security by hostile foreign agents. Edmund felt the world shifting beneath him as he tried to process this information.
Are you saying that Victor's entire appointment as advisor was fabricated?
Not fabricated, Victor said, finding his voice at last. Real, but with a hidden purpose. 6 months ago, intelligence services identified a pattern of information leaks from the palace. Sensitive details about royal schedules, security protocols, and government briefings were appearing in foreign intelligence reports.
Alexander leaned forward intently. What does any of this have to do with the photographs showing you and Mother in compromising situations?
Victor's face flushed with embarrassment. Those photographs are real, but they've been taken out of context. I was instructed to develop close relationships with key palace personnel to identify the source of the leaks. Queen Isabel was considered a potential target for manipulation by foreign agents because of her access to classified information.
So you were manipulating her, Charles said, his voice tight with anger.
Initially, yes, Victor admitted. But the situation became complicated when I realized that Her Majesty was genuinely unhappy and isolated. The close friendship we developed was supposed to be professional theater, but it became personal. Queen Isabel finally looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and betrayal.
You mean everything between us was an intelligence operation?
Not everything, Victor said softly.
The attraction was real, Isabel.
The conversations, the emotional connection, the way you made me feel, none of that was fabricated. But the circumstances that brought us together were engineered. Edmund stood and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications of this revelation.
If this is true, where are the reports from your investigation? Who was your handler? What did you discover about the security leaks? Patricia Wells withdrew another document from her briefcase. The operation was supervised by Deputy Director Caroline Fletcher from MI6.
Here are the classified reports documenting Mr. Ashworth's findings over the past 6 months. Director Harrison examined the documents with the expertise of someone who had spent his career in intelligence work. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of grudging acceptance.
These documents appear authentic, Harrison said.
The security protocols and classification markers are correct, and I recognize Fletcher's signature.
But why wasn't Palace Security informed about this operation?
Because Palace Security was one of the potential sources of the information leaks, Wells replied. The investigation couldn't risk compromising itself by involving personnel who might be part of the problem.
Prince Alexander struggled to process the rapidly shifting reality. So Mother's affair was actually an intelligence operation, but you developed real feelings during the process?
That's essentially correct, Victor said. The emotional affair was real, but the physical relationship that everyone has assumed took place never happened.
But the photographs. Victoria began. Show intimate conversations and emotional closeness, Victor finished.
We never crossed the physical line, though I admit we came close several times. The attraction was genuine, and if circumstances had been different.
Stop, Edmund said sharply.
I don't need to hear about what might have happened. Queen Isabel stood slowly, her face cycling through emotions too complex to identify.
So when I confessed to having an affair, I was confessing to something that technically never occurred?
The emotional betrayal was real, Victor said gently. Your feelings were genuine, and so were mine. The fact that we didn't act on them physically doesn't diminish the impact on your marriage. Edmund sank back into his chair, feeling overwhelmed by the revelation that his wife's betrayal was somehow both more and less than he had believed. The emotional affair still represented a violation of their marriage vows, but the absence of physical intimacy changed the nature of the scandal significantly.
What about Oliver Blackwood and the Herald story?
Sarah Matthews asked, her communications expertise focusing on the immediate practical concerns.
That's actually why I'm here, Victor said. Blackwood approached me yesterday with an offer to pay for exclusive details about my relationship with the Queen.
He has the photographs, but he's looking for confirmation of physical intimacy to justify calling it a full affair.
What did you tell him? Edmund asked.
Nothing, yet. But he's given me until noon today to provide additional information, or he's going to publish the story based on what he already has.
Alexander checked his watch. That gives us less than 2 hours. Patricia Wells stepped forward again. This is where the situation becomes complex.
Mr. Ashworth's intelligence work remains classified, and revealing it publicly could compromise ongoing national security operations.
So we can't use the truth to defend against the scandal, Charles said grimly.
Not the complete truth, Wells confirmed. However, there might be a middle path that protects both the intelligence operation and the royal family's reputation.
Edmund looked around the table at his family, noting the exhaustion and stress on their faces.
In the space of 18 hours, they had gone from confronting a devastating personal betrayal to uncovering a national security operation that had inadvertently created a constitutional crisis.
What middle path? He asked.
Director Harrison, who had been studying the intelligence documents, looked up with the first hopeful expression anyone had seen all morning.
We focus on what we can prove publicly.
Mr. Ashworth was investigating security concerns within the palace. During that investigation, he developed an inappropriate professional relationship with Her Majesty that crossed emotional boundaries but remained within legal limits.
That still acknowledges wrongdoing, Sarah pointed out.
But it frames it as a professional lapse rather than a personal scandal, Alexander said, beginning to see the potential. It also provides context that makes the behavior more understandable. Queen Isabel had remained quiet during this strategic discussion, but now she spoke with renewed strength.
What does this mean for us personally, Edmund? For our marriage?
The question hung in the air as Edmund looked at his wife with fresh eyes. The woman he had been preparing to confront as an adulteress was instead someone who had been manipulated by a government operation and had struggled with genuine feelings that she ultimately chose not to act upon.
I don't know, Edmund said honestly.
The emotional betrayal still happened. Your feelings for Victor were real, and you chose to pursue that relationship even when you knew it was inappropriate. But I also chose not to cross the ultimate line, Isabel replied. Even when I wanted to, even when the opportunity presented itself, I remembered my vows to you and our family. Victor cleared his throat awkwardly.
If I may, Your Majesties, there's one more thing you should know.
The intelligence investigation did identify the source of the palace security leaks. Everyone in the room turned toward him expectantly. It was Margaret's previous boyfriend, James Morton. He had been dating her for 8 months before Charles began seeing her. Morton works for a private security firm that contracts with several embassies, and he was systematically gathering information through Margaret about palace operations.
Prince Charles went pale. Margaret was being used? Unknowingly, yes.
Morton was feeding her leading questions about her work and her family's access to palace information. She had no idea she was providing intelligence to foreign agents.
Edmund felt another wave of revelation wash over him.
The scandal that had threatened to destroy his family was actually the resolution of a serious national security threat. Margaret Ashworth wasn't just the sister of his wife's emotional affair partner, she was an unwitting victim of espionage who had been rescued by her relationship with Charles.
Is Morton in custody? Harrison asked. As of this morning, yes. The operation concluded successfully, thanks largely to the access Mr.
Ashworth's position provided to monitor communication patterns and identify suspicious activities. Edmund stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where tourists were already beginning to gather for the morning changing of the guard.
In a few hours, those same tourists might be reading newspaper headlines about royal scandal and family betrayal.
But, instead of destruction, the morning had brought a complex story of duty, sacrifice, and, ultimately, family preservation.
So what do we tell the public? Edmund asked, turning back to face the room.
Sarah Matthews had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and now she looked up with renewed confidence. We tell them that a recent security investigation revealed inappropriate personal relationships that developed during official duties. We acknowledge that mistakes were made, but we emphasize that the investigation was successful in protecting national interests and that all parties are committed to learning from the experience.
And Oliver Blackwood's story? Victoria asked. Becomes yesterday's news, Alexander said with satisfaction.
Hard to maintain interest in a royal affair when it turns out to be a successful counterintelligence operation. Victor Ashworth looked around the room at the family he had inadvertently brought to the brink of destruction.
I want to apologize to all of you.
The operation was necessary, but the personal cost to your family was something I should have anticipated and prevented. Edmund studied the man who had unknowingly saved his marriage while nearly destroying it.
Mr. Ashworth, your service to the crown is acknowledged. However, I think it's best if your advisory position is concluded as quickly and quietly as possible. I understand, Your Majesty.
I'll submit my resignation this afternoon. As Victor and his attorney prepared to leave, Queen Isabel spoke one final time. Victor, for what it's worth, the friendship we developed was genuine. Whatever else happened, I want you to know that you helped me remember who I used to be before I became a symbol. Victor nodded gratefully. And you reminded me that duty and honor aren't just abstract concepts.
They're choices we make every day, even when those choices are painful.
After Victor departed, the royal family sat in contemplative silence. The crisis that had threatened to end their reign had instead become a story of resilience, duty, and the complex nature of human relationships under extraordinary circumstances.
So, Prince Charles said finally, breaking the quiet, I suppose this means I can keep dating Margaret?
For the first time in 24 hours, King Edmund laughed. 3 hours later, the Herald published a substantially different story than Oliver Blackwood had originally planned. Instead of explosive revelations about royal adultery, readers were treated to a carefully crafted account of a successful intelligence operation that had protected national security while demonstrating the royal family's commitment to transparency and accountability. The House of Aldermore had survived its greatest test not through perfect behavior, but through honest acknowledgement of human frailty and the strength that comes from facing truth together. As the sun set over the palace grounds that evening, King Edmund and Queen Isabel walked through the gardens hand in hand for the first time in months, beginning the long process of rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of complete honesty rather than royal perfection. The crown endured, not because its wearers were flawless, but because they were human enough to learn, forgive, and grow stronger through adversity.